In his new book, he calls the invasion monumental ignorance, but says the U.S. is the only country that has the means and resources to effect real change. From the National Press Club, this is About an Hour.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the National Press Club and another NPC Afternoon Newsmaker, and if I do say so, a rather special one. My name is Peter Hickman. I'm a former USIA Foreign Service officer, although never fortunate enough to have been stationed in our speaker's country. Now a freelance writer and editorial media consultant and past vice chairman of the club's Newsmaker Committee. And before I introduce our newsmaker, let me make the usual announcements. There will be a sound file or a recording of this newsmaker, as we do with all of them, and be available at the club's website for members only at press.org. Others may purchase a copy of the cassette from the library, or the fourth floor, I think they have it now, in the broadcast center. And if the Federal News Service is covering it, they will sell you a transcript. Please turn off any cell phones or things like that, Blackberries, Raspberries. There is a list of other speakers coming up on the bulletin board outside, and you're welcome to come to some of those, all of those. And there's material related to this afternoon's newsmaker. And that newsmaker, as you know, is the former Minister of Finance, Defense, and Trade of Iraq, and a former advisor to Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, Dr. Ali Allawi. Dr. Allawi, welcome to the National Press Club. Ahlan wa sahlan. We're very glad you could be here. And I also want to welcome the speaker's wife, Mrs. Allawi, in the second row. Madame, welcome to you. And I want to thank Liz Pelton of Yale University Press for suggesting and helping arrange this afternoon's newsmaker with Dr. Allawi. And also fellow member Pat Bergstrasser. I'm not quite sure what you did, Pat, but you did something, I know. Thank you, too. Well, copies of Dr. Allawi's bio were available, so I won't take up his speaking time by going into his background, but let me mention just a couple of the higher highlights. He has degrees from MIT, the London School of Economics, and Harvard, which reminds me that somebody called and asked me if he spoke English, and I said, yeah, I think so. He worked at the World Bank here in Washington. He was a consultant to the Arab Fund in Kuwait, and has been involved in several international financial organizations, and there's much more about him in the bio. Well, Dr. Allawi has been active in opposition to the Iraq Ba'athist regime since 1968 and took part in all the main opposition conferences, from the first in Vienna in 1992 and to the last in London in 2002. So first in, last out. And as noted, he has been Minister of Finance and Defense and Trade in Iraq. And he has just written a book which is being published in the U.S. today, and copies of which are available, as you probably know, outside. The title is The Occupation of Iraq, Winning the War, Losing the Peace. And this afternoon, Dr. Allawi is going to discuss with us some of the points and viewpoints he makes in that book. And after he speaks, he will take your questions, and please let me know your name and affiliation. Give me a signal, and then when you speak, give me your name and affiliation. And I'll call on you in turn with priority to club members and accredited media. And finally, if you haven't already done so, as you leave, please add your name to the sign-in list outside. Thank you very much. Shukran. Dr. Allawi.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The book that I wrote was really not in the works, as it were, when I first went to Baghdad. The intention was not to collect data to write a book. The book emerged primarily as my results of my own experiences and my own sense of initially perplexity and then anger at the way that events turned out in Iraq. When I first went back to Baghdad, shortly after the overthrow of the regime, I decided to keep a diary, mainly to record my own thoughts and my own experiences and my own reaction to events, both of an important nature and of less consequential nature. And as a result, I did have a record, when I look back at it, of the changing moods and the changing environment in which I found myself. I began to seriously think about writing a book sometime after the end of the first phase of the occupation of Iraq, which was the phase of the CPA. And why I think Iraq continued to be in occupation even after there was a notional transfer of power back to a so-called sovereign government was because the elements of an occupation were in place. The limited capacity of a central government to act, its nearly entire dependence on foreign military power, the intrusiveness of the administrative and support mechanisms that were left behind by the CPA in terms of the day-to-day management and policy making in Iraq all really pointed to a continuation of the unusual conditions that Iraq found itself after the overthrow of the regime. So the title, The Occupation of Iraq, may seem to have only covered the first phase of the war and the post-war environment and ended in June, but I think in reality it continues to a very large extent to present times. Not the classic form of occupation, not the one in which sovereignty is denied, where a foreign external power assumes direct authority over a country, but more, it's a different kind of limited sovereignty, one in which the central government, for good or bad reasons, is unable to exercise its authority and control over its territory. The subtext to the title, Winning the War, Losing the Peace, really encapsulates what I thought about the entire experience. Winning the war was possibly the easiest part of it. I mean, there was no question who's going to win the military engagement between the forces of the United States and the coalition on the one side and degraded and decrepit Iraqi armed forces on the other. Winning the war was never an issue, and I don't think it really exercised the minds of either military planners here or their counterparts in Baghdad, who basically gave up on the military side of the equation months before the war started, with an incoherent and ridiculous defense policy. Losing the peace is what it's all about. And again, you ask yourself, how can you lose the peace? Was peace a necessary end to the policies that drove the United States into war, to invasion and occupation? And my contention is that it could have been. It was one of those could have been stories that with better planning, better coordination, better understanding of the character of the country, which was the focus of the military and then later the political will of the United States, if you and we and by we I mean those opposition politicians in exile and those who were catapulted to power as a result of the invasion of Iraq, if we had understood the nature of the country in a more deep fashion, in a fashion that took into account the dramatic changes that had taken place in the 20 years before the invasion of the country. I left Iraq in my first time that we were forced into exile was 1958, where my extended family had been involved in government in various capacities as ministers, governors, senators, ambassadors. But the whole thing came to an abrupt end on July 14th, 1958, when the army, or not the army, but units within the army staged a coup. And the coup actually turned into a revolution, very similar to what has happened in Iraq subsequent to the invasion. That although it was a bungled affair of defense by the part of the Royal Brigade, not more than 2,000 or 3,000 troops managed to stage a coup in what was thought to be a cornerstone of US and Western defense policy in the Middle East, Iraq, which was part of the Baghdad Pact, the anti-communist Baghdad Pact. The whole thing dissolved in a few hours. But then the revolutionary cycles began in Iraq, where forces that had remained dormant for decades broke into the surface. We had a near run with being taken over by the Communist Party in 1959. In any case, my family were driven into exile. This lasted a short period of time as the various winners of the power struggle in Baghdad began to turn against themselves. So I went to school abroad. I ended up at various universities here in the UK. And then there was another coup in 1968, which was also a coup. The Ba'ath Party in 1968 did not have more than a few hundred members. And it staged a coup. But that coup also turned into another kind of revolution, and to the installation of a dictatorship and tyranny, and a systematic campaign to undermine the bases of Iraqi civil society in the name of modernization and centralization and the various isms of that period. Then I basically, at that point, I was in the World Bank here and basically gave up on the idea of ever seeing my native land again. I was in my 20s then, so it was really quite a forlorn experience being an oppositionist then. I think there were not more than a few dozen of us abroad at that point. Then our ranks were increased when the Kurdish revolt of the middle 70s collapsed, and we had now a huge number of Kurds coming into exile, and parts of whom joined the ranks of the very fragmented and disorganized opposition. Then that group of people was increased even more in the late 70s as a result of the systematic campaign by Saddam, who had then seized control over the Ba'ath Party, to decimate the Islamist opposition, particularly the Shia Islamist opposition. This coincided, of course, with the Iran-Iraq war, which created another wave, a huge wave of refugees and exiles and displaced people, mainly expelled by the regime. So throughout the 70s and 80s, the ranks of Iraqis abroad facing this regime became quite large, but we were, as I said, a forlorn lot. Very few people paid any attention to us as Saddam was organizing to fight the Iranian Revolution, and supported, as we now know, by enormous resources from the Gulf countries and also by military and other intelligence resources from the West. The Iraqi opposition at that point was mainly based in Iran and Syria, which may explain part of the reasons of the stickiness of the relationship of the post-war politicians with Iran and Syria. They were the only countries that gave any safety, any succor to the Iraqi opposition. Then when the Iran-Iraq war ended in 1988, the whole thing went into a tailspin again, particularly after the collapse of the Kurdish resistance in northern Iraq and the beginning of the infamous campaign called the Anfal, in which tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people were killed, and systematic displacement of a large number of Kurds. By the end of the Iran-Iraq war, the opposition had really collapsed again into a sense of desperation, because to all intents and purposes, Saddam emerged victorious out of that, at least politically victorious, or at least he claimed political victory. Then, of course, everything took another spin with the Gulf War. And in the Gulf War, for the first time, the United States began to establish contacts with the Iraqi opposition. Prior to that, in 1988, the United States had agreed with the then Iraqi ambassador here that they would not conduct any formal or informal contacts with the opposition in exile. But after the Gulf War, a lot of these restrictions were removed, and we all felt another upswell, as it were, as the United States came into the game as a party that was opposed to Saddam and then committed to regime change. Throughout the 1990s, as the opposition crystallized along its, what I would call its three major axes. One is the Kurdish axis, the other one is the Shia Islamist axis, and the third one is a so-called liberal axis of uneven power, I might add, because the liberal axis was by far the weakest, and its only strength could be its support by like-minded groups in the West. But in terms of its relative power, it was the weakest and was more a gathering of individuals rather than a true movement. There was no room in Iraq for liberal and secular I won't say secular, but moderate politics. In the 1990s also, two enormously significant events took place inside Iraq that set the stage for what happened subsequently. One of them is the attack on the Shia population of the south by the regime in 1991 after the failure of the March uprising. Best estimates are something like 300,000 people were killed in the process of cowing and destroying the opposition. These groups of people, the scale of the devastation and the violence had the effect of turning, well, it had several effects, but the most important one, it solidified the sectarian sentiments amongst the population in Iraq and turned the Shia decidedly against the state. Shias, as said in my book, were loyal to the country, but not to the state. And this, I think, is an issue that has come back subsequently to haunt any attempt to create a new political lineup in Iraq. The other very, very important event to which we gave very little attention was the effect on the sanctions on the population and society of Iraq. And the sanctions had a devastating effect, not in terms of people, malnutrition and all of that, but in terms of the degradation of the institutions of the state and its ability to serve the public. So the infrastructure degraded, in many cases collapsed. The distribution system, don't forget, Iraq was a highly centralized state, and nearly everybody depended in one way or another on largesse from the state or employment from the state. And when these began to be severely degraded, incomes collapsed, hyperinflation ate away at the savings of the middle classes. And we ended up in a situation at the end of the decade where Iraq had no middle class worth speaking of. Population was impoverished, and the Iraq of memory began to change in ways that I believe have become irreversible. None of these conditions, none of these circumstances of a changed society, changed identity, changed sense of loyalty affected the planners of the war, either in Washington or in lesser extent in London, or even amongst the Iraqi opposition, who were too much concerned with their own particular political agendas and how they could exploit the presence of the United States in the power balance, as it were, to their advantage. I also think that in the 1990s, during the Clinton administration, there's something like an alternative, what I call an alternative discourse on the Middle East was gathering steam here. And it came out in think tanks and came out in various reports, various individuals. And this alternative discourse became the discourse after the elections of 2000. So what was on the fringe, as it were, of American security thinking and foreign policy thinking came into the center. And then after 9/11, I think it basically defined the policy drives. And when the time came to go to war, I think it became irreversible sometime. We could sense that in the opposition sometime around the summer of 2002. The main markers were set out then. It was clear that we were entering into a phase which very few of us knew what to expect, apart from the military angle and apart from the need to position yourself to take advantage of the opportunities for enhancing or establishing your power. Now, whether this was what set the stage for what the original title of my book was, The Incoherence of Power, but it wasn't felt to be a sufficiently resounding title. And I think this is what it's all about. After the invasion of Iraq in March of 2003, there was a set of policy prescriptions and positions and decisions that were really not only inappropriate and inexplicable, but in context were incoherent. And this is really quite surprising to a person such as myself, because we know the abilities and capabilities of the United States, and we know what the United States did in similar contexts, where it took on the responsibility of rebuilding states or entire continents, as the case was after World War II. How can this be allowed to be the governing program of a country that had embarked on, at least publicly, on what seemed to be a civilizational makeover of the Middle East? So the theme throughout the book is that. It's the law of unintended consequences coming back to hit you with a vengeance. And each and every aspect of that law, which was formulated by a famous sociologist, Robert Merton, was systematically undermined. I mean, nobody, when the project first started, very few people knew about the country they were invading and occupying. A lot of the decisions were driven by non-rational decisions that would be normal. The decision-making process in the business of statecraft does not allow for these kinds of irrational and inexplicable ideologically driven decisions. Neither does it make sense that if you embark on a policy of occupying a country, that you don't have a systematic, detailed governing plan with the right people in the right place. Neither does it make sense that you can occupy a country, but it's like a half-hearted occupation. You have one foot in and one foot out. One foot on the pedal and the other on the brake. One foot on the accelerator and the other on the brake. And I saw that from time to time, the powerlessness of the Iraqi ministers and the government during the CPA period, the existence of shadow governments and where real power resided, the unwillingness to accept that the overthrow of the regime unleashed forces of immense consequence, not only inside Iraq but in the region as a whole. The main effects of the overthrow of the regime internally in Iraq was really one positive and two very, very disturbing to the power structure. The positive side, I think, is the fact that a certain system of power and authority, which was based primarily on control over the security apparatus part and based upon a certain dictatorial / authoritarian style of rule in the Middle East, taken to an extreme level, has been replaced by some form of institutional arrangements for elections, for a form of constitutional politics. That's a positive. On negatives, not on the negative, but on the very disturbing side, is the fact that communities, entire communities, accounting for demographic majorities, were suddenly empowered, and others were disempowered. The empowerment of the Shia community, for example, demographic majority by all reckoning, was something that would have been inconceivable were it not for the events that led to the invasion of Iraq. I don't think any combination of forces would have led to the possibility of this dramatic shift in power within this period of time, without the intrusion in a massive way of an external force. The other major effect has been, of course, the mirror image of that is the disempowerment of the Sunni Arab community. And I think here you have to see it in terms of what Iraq meant to the Middle East state system. It may have been a dictatorship frequently at odds with its neighbors. In some cases, it invaded one of them, occupied it. But in terms of the broader regional context, Iraq was seen as decidedly part of the so-called Arab camp, and that it was working within a Sunni Islamic framework as the region became more Islamized in the 1980s and 90s. So it was, to some extent, in a perverse way, a bulwark of that order. That crashed. how the Sunni Arab community, in their purported role as guardians of the Arab and Islamic identity of Iraq, how they reacted was something that was completely out of people's understanding or comprehension. Obviously, now looking back, they were reacting not necessarily logically, but extremely violently for loss of power, which they could not believe could have been regained in a new system. Of course, the other thing that happened was the major fillip, as it were, given to the Kurds' drive towards some form of, not autonomy, but a confederal arrangement in Iraq, which may or may not lead in the near or distant future into a nation state. That was not taken into account, not so much in Iraqi terms, but in regional terms. So you have these terrible side effects with momentous significance affecting every country in the area. And it did not affect them in the sort of, mechanical sense that, well, here is Iraq is going to become a democratic constitutional country and therefore it's going to threaten the political systems of these neighbors. No, it went far deeper than that. And each country, I think, surrounding Iraq, with the possible exception of Kuwait, felt deeply threatened, or deeply challenged, let's say, by the events in Iraq. Some cases, I think, existentially so, that's the right word. So the Turkish response to Iraqi issues is dictated by the reality of the existence of a very powerful current within the Kurdish areas for autonomy, confederation, and possibly some form of status. Iran, on the other hand, had other things to worry about. They had to worry about the presence of large U.S. forces nearby. What does that mean for their own stability of their own system? But on the positive side, the Shia community, which in part identifies with Iran, not as a terms of where its loyalties lie, but in terms of an ultimate ally, is certainly to the advantage of Iran. So Iran has been empowered, whether we like it or not, by the change in the political order in the country. Saudi Arabia feels deeply threatened by Shia ascendancy, and because it's going to affect their own treatment of their own minorities, and particularly the Shia minorities, how they respond to that, and whether they're going to look at it as a mortal threat, whether Iraq has to be quarantined, somehow co-opted, but an existential threat. They treated it initially by relying on America to provide the solution. Now I think they've given up, and they recognize they have to get into the game now, because the United States has reached a point where it may very well change its strategic engagement with Iraq. Similarly, a country like Jordan, which relies a lot on its economic well-being to preferential trade and economic arrangements with Iraq, finds the possibility that Iraq's economic access might change entirely to its detriment. Syria sees the demise of the Ba'ath Party and wonders whether it may be next in line, or whether it may somehow be spared this in exchange for some assuredness that the state will continue. Turkey, on the other hand, is obviously concerned for its own security if this move towards Kurdish autonomy / confederation doesn't lead to questioning the state system in Turkey itself. I mean, the figures are all over the place, but anywhere between 20 to 30% of Turkey may be of Kurdish origin. So these are the consequences of a war that were not gauged adequately when the time came to make the decision to go to war. And the Iraqi political class has been also, to a very large extent, unable or incapable of getting its hands over these problems, and getting its hands not only over the problems of these larger security and strategic issues, but also managing a state that is dysfunctional. In many ways, from a pure, say, engineering point of view, the running of the Saddami state is much better than what we have now. If you take out if you're looking at it from as it were, a value-free proposition. The state is more corrupt now. It has more incompetence in more positions of authority than it ever had before. And it's doing a terrible job of managing the affairs of the country. Where we go from here, I think if things continue along the track that we have, I don't think we could expect things to improve drastically in the near term. At some point, obviously, civil wars or civil conflicts have to end, and one side has to win or some kind of deal is struck. But as things, if you take the trajectory of the past and push it into the future, we may get a reasonably stable central state, but which is unable to exercise its authority beyond maybe 60 or 70% of the country. The Kurdish areas will become more and more distant and separate. Iraq will not fragment into its components, not because they don't want to, but because the international system won't allow it. I think nobody will recognize these countries. So they will stay in this enforced union. I think the time has come for the United States to take the lead, actually, in doing a U-turn. And by that I mean there has to be a recognition that the military solution is insufficient, that the political resolution of domestic Iraqi groups is impossible if you don't relate it to the loss or gain of power and the security interests of nearby countries. Some form of, I think, not conference, but international congress needs to be called, led possibly by the United States, where an individual or individuals are given a kind of super ambassadorial powers to negotiate a security architecture for the Middle East, excluding Palestine is another issue. And that would in turn reflect on the domestic power arrangements. For that to happen, I think all the gainers in this game, this terrible game, namely Iraq, namely the Shias, the Kurds, to some extent Iran and Syria, have to pull back in terms of their demands, both internally as well as internationally. And the perceived losers have to be given a bit more to come to a kind of resolution of interests that would underpin, I think, a new political order in Iraq, based on largely on the current constitutional makeup, but one that would have the imprint of nearby countries as well as the international community. And at that point, I think there will be a kind of international body sponsored by the United States, I believe, that would oversee this transition process. I'm not saying you should abandon the constitution or you should abandon the political results that have emerged from the elections, but they have to be brought together, they have to be told or shown that their interests can only be optimized but not maximized, as the engineers say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Allawi. Your questions now. Please give your name and affiliation. Yes, sir. First question.
Good afternoon, Mike Tillman, ACN Television. The American occupation presence in Iraq, is it helping or hurting the end of this war?
I think it is, well, it's helping on one side and it's hindering on the other side. It's helping in the sense that it's helping the central government to establish security where it matters, in Baghdad, but not where it also matters, which is outside of Baghdad. It's hindering in the sense that the strengthening of the central government, which is a good thing in one way, may not necessarily be good for long-term stability if it doesn't lead to serious compromises being made with other groups that are threatening the government. So paradoxically, you may end up in a situation which is good in one side, but not necessarily good in the strategic sense. But I think the US forces, there must be a plan for withdrawal based upon an end state that is realizable. And that end state should go beyond just that an Iraqi government that can sustain and defend itself. It's not good enough for the area. No Iraqi government will be able to sustain and defend itself if its region rejects it.
The gentleman, I can see a hand. You can say who you are.
Okay, Rodney Livingston, SBNN.net. The United States, and you may know the total and complete history, by example, is a wife beater and a child abuser. And I use racism in the United States, prejudice in the United States, segregation in the United States. In the 21st century, the autochthonous people are still in concentration camps. The United States refuses to properly train its military and equip its military. So how can anyone, you included, be under the illusion that the United States, the failed state in its own land, could bring freedom, liberty, democracy, and the like someplace else when it's not able to do it here in the United States, unless you really don't know the history of the United States or you don't recognize the history in your relationship with the United States.
Well, I'm not sure this is a question, but no, I'll just say we have a saying in Arabic, which is, if you're a foreigner in a country, you should be courteous to its people. That's my answer.
Mr. Iraqi, thank you for being here. You referred to the International Congress as an international effort to bring the regional powers to help the security, the architectural plan for the security in Iraq. But I also believe you mentioned that it should be led by the U.S. How is it this time the U.S. is going to, apart from the U.S. interest in Iraq, how is the U.S. leading efforts like this is going to accomplish a regional security or even internal security in Iraq, given, for example, Iran today is pretty much, why would they sit at a negotiation table given that the U.S. is leading these efforts?
Well, I think...
And if I may add, is there any other alternative for these efforts to be led by any other power other than the U.S.?
I mean, I think the U.S. is critical to the equation. And I preface my remarks by saying there should be a U-turn. And by a U-turn, I mean a fundamental turnaround in thinking, in terms of strategic thinking, in terms of what's important and what's not important in the Middle East. And you have to move from this military fixation to this new architecture. Now, whether this administration can do it or not, I don't know. But it has been done in the past. I mean, the most unlikely champions of, for example, anti-communism, Nixon, ended up going to China. People do U-turns, radical U-turns in politics, if the balance of interests would indicate that way. So I don't think we should write off the United States simply because the last 4 years has been, or the last 6 years or whatever, has been a failed engagement in Iraq. It is the only country that has the means and resources to be able to effect real change on the ground. Frankly, I think any other country would have sank a long time ago, given the stresses inside the country, inside Iraq.
John Weiner with the Progressive Government Institute. And a couple of weeks ago, we helped facilitate a live video conference with members of the U.S. Congress and members of the Iraq Parliament, who included Saleh al-Wallach, Mohammed al-Bani, and we had Jim Barry on the phone. And they represented themselves to be part of the National Salvation Front, members of the Iraq Parliament who were nationalists, who wanted one Iraq, who wanted us to eventually leave, wanted oil to be centralized, and tell us that they're trying to organize a majority in the Parliament so that it can literally vote out and allocate and have a secular government. And your names come up as maybe one of the people who will be part of this. And the first question is this something that's happening, if you know about it, something you're interested in? Is it hope for us that we would have a political solution this way, that we would be able to see the Iraqis themselves take over government with a different kind of government and succeed in bringing the resistance in and starting the process of ending the killing and maiming of Kurds and Iraqis?
I think they can basically dream on, but yes, it's unlikely to happen because you say a secular government. Iraqi politics is currently sectarian, and there's no way of wishing it away. It's not designed by well-meaning parliamentarians. I mean, may or may not include me. It's the first time I've heard of it. But the point is that for you to be able to function within the framework of parliamentary politics in Iraq, you have to have a parliamentary majority. And the parliamentary majority doesn't belong to them. It belongs to groups that owe their allegiance to the Shia Islamist parties, who are in turn supported by the clerical leadership in Najaf. This is the real street power of these groups. And if you're playing the electoral game, you have to, ultimately it has to be votes in ballot boxes. And currently the secular liberal moderates, I think, don't account for a significant percentage either of the parliament or of the popular vote. That doesn't mean it can't happen. And I don't think it will ever happen, frankly, if this thing continues for another 12 to 18 months, because there would be control over the state structures by the majority party or parties. And this is not the United States. I mean, they would use the resources of the government to their advantage, and they would tilt the balance of power to perpetuate them in power. So, and I don't think it is also feasible to say we'll bring in the good guys of the resistance and separate them from the bad guys, the Al-Qaeda and the terrorists and people like that. The good guys of the resistance really want power. They may want it without using terrorism, but that's what they want. They want to go to the status quo ante. How to reconcile all of these things without taking into account the street power of the Islamist parties, the distancing from the center by the Kurdish groups, the involvement of regional countries, including non-governmental organizations. For example, I think the insurgents are funded largely by UAE-based charities and groups, and also from Saudi Arabia. When I was Minister of Defense, there was a guy who was caught with $50,000 coming in from Saudi Arabia, claiming he's distributing these for charitable purposes. So if you don't do this within a context where every group is brought together and basically not read the Riot Act, but shown that it's in their interest to reduce their maximalist demands, I don't think we can get stable government.
Ron Biggins is next, Sean, and then this one later. Ron.
I'm Ron Biggins of Kuwait, New Zealand. I just wanted to know if you could address there's a lot of talk in Washington about whether the Maliki government is, say, not wanting to move quite so fast on the oil law, move the pacification law, and the U.S. is saying we need to hurry up. And I guess what I'm trying to say is this is a sovereign nation of Iraq. It may want to move at its own pace on these critical issues. And how do you see this shaping up as we near the end of the Bush administration on these sort of key issues?
Well, these are markers, as it were, put up by the U.S. Embassy to the Maliki government. I mean, they go back to the Hadley memo and so on, and basically is to put their feet against the fire. But nothing works in this Cartesian way in Iraq. You know, there's no cause and effect necessarily. So the fact that we have an oil law, really behind the oil law, there's an entire issue of how revenues are going to be distributed and who owns what, which goes into the heart of the issue of provincial and regional authority versus central authority. So you can't expect that to be sort of wished away or just, legislated overnight. The other issue of de-Baathification, I think it's a very clear indicator of where real power lies in certain areas. I mean, this entire law, which was supposedly co-sponsored by the President and the Prime Minister to reduce the effect of de-Baathification, has been thrown out of the window because Grand Ayatollah Sistani rejected it. I mean, we go back to the same, if you ignore where authority lies, you are bound to face the consequences of it subsequently. It reminds me of when the CPA tried to legislate for a transition process that did not include elections. And Sistani came on board, and his first fatwa was ignored in June of 2003. Subsequently, they had to take it into account. Similarly here, I mean, de-Baathification, which may be an important marker for an attempt at bringing back some of the dissident elements into the government or into power, will sink if it's not supported by the spiritual leadership.
May I follow up with you? Is it safe to say then that the sovereign government of Iraq would like to address these issues at a pace at which it's comfortable and not necessarily at a pace at which maybe the U.S. would like?
I think so. And yes, and they will address it in a way that they think. They will address it in the way that they want to construct it, not the way it's constructed by others.
Yeah. What would constitute the kind of U-turn that we're talking about? I mean, the kind of radical redirection. Obviously, you don't think that the surge constitutes that kind of a U-turn. Do you see the Baker-Hamilton recommendations as coming close to your definition of a major strategic shift in U.S. policy? And what about the American dilemma? I mean, they cannot talk to Sistani directly, that is. They cannot talk to, they tried to talk to the radical Sunni elements. It didn't work out through Khalid Zaid. Muqtada Sadr is beyond the pale as far as they're concerned. Abdulaziz al-Hakim, they tried to deal with him again. I mean, maybe the American Cartesian mind is not working in Iraq, I don't know. But I mean, what is preventing the Iraqis themselves from also searching for a way out? I mean, it's very easy to compile the American blunders one over the other, and I'm sure you've done that in your book without admitting it. But what can be done, practically speaking, that is achievable by way of talking to the Sunnis, or to the Shia, beyond going to the neighbors like the Iranians and the Syrians? If you can be as specific as possible. I know it's a difficult.
Well, I mean, I think we have to go beyond Baker and Hamilton. And Baker and Hamilton is just, to me, is a starting point and is an Americo-centric resolution of the issue. It's not an Iraqi-centered one. The current Iraqi political class does not have an answer but they have something to do with enhancing their own power and their own relative power, which may work either in favor or against an overall resolution of the problem. That's why I don't think that there is such a thing as an Iraqi solution in the context of the crises that we have inside the country and regionally. I mean, in concrete terms, what I would expect is some kind of a super ambassador, maybe not of a very high caliber, not necessarily an American, but one who is attuned to American thinking and knows obviously what are the main American benchmarks as it relates to Iraq. Some kind of super Akhdar Ibrahimi, not necessarily related to the UN, but working towards creating the conditions for resolving all the issues that have emerged out of the Iraq crisis. And by this I mean the extent of Shia empowerment in the country in terms of what it can be internally tolerated and regionally tolerated, the extent of Sunni disempowerment, the extent of Kurdish autonomy, the extent of each country's legitimate interests inside Iraq. And if the United States cannot conduct negotiations with Iran, that doesn't mean this super ambassador person, whoever he or she may be able to do that without necessarily running over or ignoring key American milestones or interests involved. But the U-turn I'm talking about is to think in terms of a security architecture in place as a result of the post-Iraq conflict, post-conflict Iraq, and one that articulates, acknowledges, accepts, but at the same time tries to limit the losers and gainers and the winners and losers in this game, and one that is able to reconcile, perhaps at the low common denominator. We might not get a perfect democracy in Iraq, We might not get maximalist demands being acknowledged, but we will know that whatever is achieved by one group is not necessarily entirely at the expense of another group. So the zero-sum mentality has to cease to prevail. And I think it is doable if you have a vision for this architecture down the line. I hope to write something about that. So.
Sean Roney, Voice of America. I'm wondering your thoughts about a set date for U.S. troop withdrawal. Would you find it effective for a handover of power to the occupational forces leaving, or would it be a springboard for more violence? And then secondly, before the press conference, I got a hand on your book, and I looked through the preface, and I noticed that after 9/11, you called a close friend of yours and said, well, I see the U.S. going into Afghanistan, overthrowing the Taliban, and then overthrowing or having a regime change with Saddam. I'm wondering if you have any other predictions for the region.
Well, I think, see, if you say that if you're going to give a time definite for U.S. presence in Iraq without undertaking a kind of replacement system for the area, what will happen is, maybe it's a good thing, but what will happen is that you will strengthen the hold of certain groups and communities over the central state. The current Iraqi state is increasingly dominated by the Shia Islamist parties. I'm saying that as a matter of fact, not as a matter of I'm not impinging any value to it. This, in my mind, will not be a stable state because the 20% minority will not necessarily accept being put into a state which has overtly sectarian features. You will say, all right, well, 20% don't constitute a majority. True, but 20% connected to a regional system that rejects Shia ascendancy in Iraq do constitute a very serious threat to the stability, long-term stability of the country. You may say, fine, we leave. The government, the so-called government, will maintain its control over the state, but it will be an unstable end result. What I'm thinking of, it may be an acceptable end result in terms of American domestic politics, but it is not necessarily acceptable in terms of trying to come to terms with over the whole spectrum of effects that originated as a result of the Iraq War.
Thank you. Evren Ban with Turkey's İhlas News Agency. I just did. Evren Ban with Turkey's İhlas News Agency. You mentioned Turkey's concerns regarding Kurdish issue. Mesut Barzani just made a statement a day ago saying that if Turkey starts a cross-border operation into northern Iraq, they would not hesitate to invade the Kurdish city of Diyarbakir in southeast Turkey. Do you see a potential risk of an armed conflict between Turkey and Kurdish forces in northern Iraq in the near future?
I mean, I don't think the Kurdish leaders in Iraq are sensible people, and they're unlikely to enter into adventures of this kind. So I think if there is a serious incursion on the part of Turkey beyond, say, the border areas after the PKK, but one that is trying to change the results on the ground inside Kurdistan, it's not likely, but it is a possible outcome that there will be increased border tension and cross-border fighting.
From Voice of America, Dr. Allawi. I have a question on that international congress you just proposed. Considering all the intra-conflicts between Shia, Sunni, and Kurds, how do you suppose an international congress can help that? And the United States may not agree to it and may say, we're the one who lost all the lives and spent all the US dollars. Why would we ask other countries to come and express their opinion why we lost the lives? So if you could elaborate on that.
Well, it's to do with being really pragmatic in politics. I mean, if you follow an ideological prescription that we're into this, come rain or shine, then obviously what I said doesn't hold water. But if there's a recognition that the trajectory of the past has failed, then you have no choice. The only choices that we seem to be faced is either withdrawal, which can lead to, I think, either a strengthening of the sectarian nature of the state, which will lead to, in my mind, greater insecurity and instability, or it will lead to a free-for-all. So if there is still a chance, a last chance in this exercise, we have to see what will happen. But my own prescriptions is that it won't happen. And the reason why I think Iran and Syria, countries on the so-called axis of evil, would come into the game is because contrary to what people think, they're also interested in stability and securing their regimes, while at the same time enhancing their relative power regionally. But I think they would be prepared to enter into a deal like that and stick to it if their gains are acknowledged but limited, rather than rejected or contained.
I'm sorry, I got things in order. You had your hand up a long time ago.
Yes, Olivia Kuzabedi from NHK. I just had a quick question. To what extent do you think the growing sectarian divide in Iraq already has or is spreading to other countries in the region? What are the consequences for Iraqis themselves, for people in the region and beyond? And then in such a context, do you believe that Iraq can still be be a model for other countries in the region? Thank you.
Well, I'll answer the last question first. I mean, I don't think Iraq is a model for anything right now. So, there's no way that anybody would see the experience of the last 4 years as in any way positive or indicator as to how they should organize their affairs. As for the Shia issue, I think, yes, it is very serious. There is a serious problem in the sense that the Shias are scattered as minorities throughout the Gulf. And in Lebanon, they're a plurality, but not a majority. So their real weight is in Iraq in terms of the Arab populations. And there, I think, if an overtly sectarian government comes in power, basically reversing a mirror image of the old Sunni-dominated order, we now have a Shia-dominated order, although it's a majority. It will lead to, I think, very serious consequences to the Shias of the Gulf, especially of Saudi Arabia. I mean, I can't really predict. The Saudi regime is generally flexible in terms of its own internal domestic affairs and prefers to negotiate rather than confront. But I think if they are faced with a strategic threat from an assertive Shia-dominated sectarian Iraq that is one way or another, maybe not even allied to Iran, but can act as a kind of beacon for the Shias of the area, they would take measures against their own population, own Shia population. Not necessarily in the Gulf countries, but Saudi Arabia possibly. Or they will ratchet up the pressures in Lebanon, which is the usual outlet for inter-Arab frustrations.
Follow-up. To what extent do you think this has taken pressure off of semi-dictatorial regimes in the Middle East to actually implement reform in their countries?
I think a great deal. Frankly, the word revolution, which was seen to be a liberating and progressive sentiment in the Middle East before, I think many people will be very, very hesitant now to call for radical change.
Just about out of time, but I have 3 more questions. Please make them very short. First, you're on the left. Second, and third is over in the back.
The Foreign Policy Association is on the position of America, especially the static position of America at this moment, in view of the utterances of Muqtada Sadr recently. Has America really been reckoned as a liberator or an occupier, or should America cut its losses and go back home?
Well, America is a liberator to the Kurds. You won't find any Kurd who will not vote for George Bush, I think. In the case of the Sunnis, America is an occupier, pure and simple. In the case of the Shias, I would hazard to say 70 or 80% of the Shias think America is an occupying force. attitude towards the United States presence in Iraq vary, whether you're in the governing class or whether you're in the mass of the public. The mass of the public will say the sooner they go, the better. The ruling elite needs them, so they will find any excuse to keep American troops there, not only to establish security, but to enhance their own relative power. So, to some extent, the U.S. is in the same bind it was in the last years of Vietnam, when it was clear that the war was not going to be won in a classic way. And Nguyen Van Thieu and all of these people started to play games with the presence of U.S. troops there. So there's a lot to be learned in the last 2 or 3 years of the Vietnam War. And a lot of there's no comparison between the wars as such, but a lot of the issues that emerged there in the 1960s, late 60s, early 70s, are beginning to reappear now. I mean, I was in the United States then. I could see similarities in the argument. Once I think it's called the tipping point is reached, I think you can't really regain public trust for this war.
Last question, very short, please.
I'm Carl Osgood, I write for Executive Intelligence Review. Do you have, or in fact, does anybody have any good sense of the demographic costs of this war? I mean, the UN has an estimate of how many people have been displaced and are refugees outside the country. So nobody really seems to know how many Iraqis have died as a result of this, or the traumatization of the population as a whole. Do you have a sense of that at all?
Well, I mean, there are high and low figures. The high figure is this Lancet figure that came out about a few months ago, which talks about 650,000 dead. I mean, this is a statistical method of extrapolating, and it may be accurate. I think it's on the high side. And then there's a low figure of around 100,000. Possibly maybe 250,000 people have been killed. It's whatever it is, it's a very large number.
Last question.
Dana Milbank from the Washington Post. Suppose this U-turn isn't made. Can you just spell out what would happen over the coming months and years?
Yes, I think if this U-turn isn't made, the last years of the Vietnam War is instructive. There will be an attempt to portray the Iraqi government as being in control, and either point out to certain geographic areas. The south is safe, Kurdistan is safe, Baghdad is relatively secure. I said you will strengthen the authority of the central government, but not necessarily over the entire country. And the instability of the country will continue. And that instability will not necessarily be contained by improvements or enhancement of the political process. So the seeds of instability and insecurity will remain. But I think the U.S. may, under current domestic variables, may find itself being pulled out by the end of the year, either through end of 2008, either through congressional action or by a new president coming in. So, but the end state, as far as Iraq is concerned, will not be the one that I think will lead to either internal or regional stability.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you didn't sign in when you came in, please do so when you leave. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. مرحبا اهلا وسهلا شلون والله دقيقة لكن عندنا ارتباطات عندنا لا